Hello, everyone. I'm not really sure if we're live yet or not. This is kind of the first time doing this, so I'm trying to get an idea if we're ready to go yet. I think I hit the wrong button and erased the PowerPoint. So, yeah, there we go. All right, our tech guy just said we're good to go. So, all right, so I'm having to re-upload the slides, and then we'll be able to go through those as we go. So let me introduce myself first. Hello. My name is Brian Simmons. I am a therapist in South Lake, Texas, in private practice. And I'm also a former law enforcement officer as well. I've been a law enforcement officer for 16 years. 11 years of that was full-time. 5 years of that I was a reserve officer. I was with the city of Dallas and then also with the Kaufman County Sheriff's Office. So I guess this combination of experience makes it kind of unique for me to have the opportunity to talk on this particular subject. So here we go. There's the slides. All right, excellent. So today we're going to talk about child soldiers. We're going to give a little bit of discussion on just the recovery aspect of it, and then also the restoration and reorganization elements of it. So if there are any questions, I'm going to ask that, again, we have a chat area. However, it's really hard, from what I understand, to keep up and answer the questions and do the presentation all at the same time. So I'm going to ask that, if possible, you could email any questions that you might have to me. I'm going to see real quick here if I can stick a message in here regarding my email address, because I'm not sure it's part of the presentation. Here we go. And so if you have any direct questions, please email me, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. Zach, who is our tech guy, asked that if there are any questions regarding the actual presentation itself, as far as maybe not getting the picture or getting kicked out or something like that, that you would use the chat area to communicate directly with him. I think that'll probably be the best way to do it. So, all right, so let me see if, okay, so there you go. There is my email address. It's up for y'all. It is under Robert Roden, who is an incredible individual, by the way, and we're so glad that he's putting this on, the Arizona Trauma Institute. We want to thank him very much for this. But anyways, so Zach, if you could just give me a confirmation that we're good to go, because I do see that there is a message that one of the individuals can't hear me. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So somebody's texted through that they can hear me, and then Zach confirmed it as well. Awesome. So, all right. So let me just tell you a little bit about, I guess, again, my experience with this particular topic, because again, that's what everybody wants to know, right? Like, why were you the chosen one to talk on this particular subject? So again, I'm not gonna say that I'm an expert on child soldiers, as much as I would, like to, I guess, have more pedigree in my background to be able to talk about that. It's a very difficult population to actually have the opportunity to work with. And so on one hand, I guess that's a good thing, right? Because that means that a lot of the soldiers that are utilized are confined to certain areas or conflict zones. Now, what I will say is that I have been exposed to child soldiers, and I have had the opportunity to sit down and talk with them. My wife and I both are building a trauma program in Iraq. She did a webinar last week. Dr. Stephanie Thurston Simmons, that's my wife, so amazing woman, great in every way, just let me say. But she and I have made multiple trips to Iraq, and I spent 30 days over there last year during the summer, actually helping work with the networks that are facilitating rescues from ISIS at that time. Now, obviously, unfortunately, a lot of what's happened over there has kind of subsided. ISIS has been pretty much beat back. However, not defeated. They're relocating to different areas. So, and I still keep in contact with a lot of folks that I work with that are ex-military, ex-law enforcement, that are out doing the rescues and working with networks and trying to continue to rescue individuals that are being held and utilized in different forms of human trafficking. So, So again, we designed last year, my wife and I sat down, and we actually designed a pilot program to run a camp for 30 young boys that there were plans to rescue from ISIS. Unfortunately, that rescue plan fell apart, partially because they started moving them frequently to different locations to prevent them from being centralized. And then they were actually, unfortunately, put into service to defend ISIS when things started turning bad before they had a chance to be rescued. So that was something we were looking forward to being able to implement over there. But again, it kind of fell through. So, but what I'm going to talk about, though, today, and to kind of give you a background, and I know, again, there are individuals out there that I'm sure have a lot more experience working with child soldiers than I obviously do. But as part of putting that plan together, a lot of what my wife and I did was we got into that world. We talked to folks. We did a lot of research to try and understand what that environment is like, right? And to work with them. And obviously, there are some strong parallels and similarities with things we've experienced here in the United States as far as how children are used and recruited by gangs, how they get into what the family of origin stuff is, what allows them entrance into sort of a life of crime or that sort of thing. So we're going to move forward. We're going to talk through just generally kind of statistics and look at some dynamics and just talk in general about how to work and treat that population in general if ever you get the opportunity. The interesting thing is, as much as there are multiple issues that present with trafficking victims, one of the areas that I specialize in is working with human trafficking victims, both domestically and internationally. I currently work with women in Iraq via remotely, doing counseling with them right now. And then I also work with American victims who've been rescued out of the sex industry or rescued out of human trafficking. So I've got a very diversified experience. And there's a lot to be said about the age in which children are recruited into whatever form of human trafficking exists. Okay, so I'm trying to keep this screen from moving here, so I apologize if I'm making anybody nauseous. It's a beautiful day here in Texas, which I don't typically get to say in August very much because normally it's about 900 degrees, but it is a comfortable like 82 out here. So I just want to sit outside and have this today. So I hope that's okay. All right, so let's look at our topics of discussion. So we're going to talk about three in particular. So first off, we're going to look at the statistics around both human trafficking and child soldiers. And we're going to look at the characteristics of that population in general. And then we're going to look at challenges that occur when treatment challenges that present themselves. Again, had a chance to witness these firsthand with a lot of the children we had a chance to meet with when we were in Iraq. And then also talk about some models and research that commonly the most empirically validated or research-based models out there for how to treat that population. And again, one of the models we're going to talk about in particular, there's really no research behind it all. It's one you're going to potentially hear about, even domestically, and it's not an empirically validated model. It is very hard to assess treatment outcomes from that model. But I want to talk about it because you may bump into this, right? It doesn't matter whether it's somebody exiting a cult or whether, again, it's a child that's coming out of a gang life. Because it has to center around basically the idea of reprogramming, right? And how you quote unquote deprogram, which is not a term you utilize if you are someone who understands the kind of work that we do. That is not it is not a academically supported or validated term when we're talking about really the appropriate application of mental health for individuals that have these kind of struggles. So. Okay. All right. So hold on a second. I got to increase the size of this a little bit so I can read it. There we go. Okay. I hope I'm still in the field of view here. All right. Okay. There we go. So, all right. So child soldier. Child soldiers, it's a type of human trafficking using persons younger than 18 who are being recruited or forced into groups or organizations to be used in any capacity, such as messengers, fighters, cooks, spies, porters, or even for sexual purposes to, in essence, gratify the needs of soldiers, okay? It includes both boys and girls who are exploited because of their age-based vulnerability. Psychological tactics, along with physical and sexual abuse, are oftentimes used to increase compliance and to eliminate the resistance that they receive, okay? Now, one of the things that is so absolutely damaging to these children is the age at which they're taken, all right? Children are recruited as soldiers oftentimes when a population in an area is overrun. So a lot of times this ends up being a part of a genocide or a part of one culture battling against another or some sort of religious infighting or one group fighting against another. So oftentimes there's a lot of extermination that is happening at the time in the population. So the result of that is you have all these children that have no purpose. And so there's two options, right? Either we execute those children, or a group may decide to take those children and either use them as a commodity, i.e. introduce them into the sex trafficking world, okay, or as labor trafficking, or I can utilize them as a soldier, right, and help grow my ranks and facilitate my cause, identifying their vulnerability, their age-based vulnerability, to be able to exploit and turn into a solid soldier who will fight for my cause. So basically, I'm going to take them and I'm going to change their moral beliefs. I'm going to change their spiritual beliefs. I'm going to turn them against whatever population I want to, and then I'm going to use some of the immaturity that comes with their age, and I'm going to turn them into just absolutely fearless fighting machines. And this is where you have kids that when they reach the high enough levels of dissociation, and if they're bonded enough with their traffickers, that they will do anything. They'll be suicide bombers. They'll do whatever, right? So unfortunately, real problematic, okay? So it's estimated that 20.9 million persons are victims of human trafficking worldwide, okay? In general, now is a time where we have more individuals that are victims of human trafficking than any time in our history as a world, okay? Geographically speaking. So there's no doubt, I don't think in anybody's mind at this point, that the internet and the advent of technology has really enhanced the ability of networks to work worldwide, and also to utilize and communicate with one another so that you can have all the different components of a trafficking experience work fluidly together, everything from organized crime to individuals who are merchants that are getting people and goods from place to place. It has just become, honestly, a very efficient, highly focused, highly mobile operation that can be tweaked and changed at a moment's notice whenever, to avoid law enforcement or to avoid any sort of interference. And unfortunately, that is leading to just mass amounts of people being turned out into the markets. Now, the United States obviously is what we call a destination nation. Places where there are conflict zones are oftentimes considered nations of origin. So we don't think typically that the United States is someplace we're going to come across a trafficking victim. However, we know that roughly at any given time, there are anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 trafficked individuals within our nation's borders, being utilized for a variety of different services. So when we talk about the life of a child soldier, what might they experience? Well, 70% of them will have witnessed different forms of beatings or tortures, beheadings, just horrible acts of violence. 63% have witnessed violent deaths. 77% have witnessed other forms of violence, such as stabbing, body parts or heads being chopped off, and most of that's occurred close up, right? So 62% have been beaten themselves by members of their own group that they're now a part of. 52% have witnessed large-scale massacres. 39% have been regularly forced to ingest drugs. And 45% of girls and 5% of boys have been raped by their captors as part of this process of being indoctrinated. So let's talk about some of the characteristics you might experience. So child soldiers obviously endure extreme physiological and psychological abuse as part of the indoctrination process. Okay, a lot of times, again, remember that these soldiers may be born within the population that is actively aggressing in a particular area. So again, they may be part of the same religious sect. They may be directly the children of other fighters that maybe that fighter died and that child was then forced in to be a soldier, okay? Or they're going to be basically likely a population that has been conquered, okay, or where an area has been taken over. So they have to be turned, all right? They have to be turned to the cause. And obviously, the younger they are, the more malleable they are. But also the more damage that's incurred as a result, and ultimately, the more difficult it is to turn that individual back to a healthy way of functioning, all right? So physiologically, when they're rescued, if they have the opportunity to be rescued, they may have injuries. They may have illnesses. There's going to be a general likelihood there's going to be a neglect of their basic needs. I mean, in essence, these are soldiers on the front a lot of times. So these children are not given the best food, right? They're given the same food other soldiers eat, and their needs aren't cared for because they're in a conflict zone all the time. So they're just surviving literally minute to minute, moment to moment. So imagine now how difficult this is, right? Because we have a passion inside all of us, I'm sure, as do I, to be able to be someone who would rescue, right? I want to go out and I want to make something better, you know? I want to be able to rescue these kids. And so when the information comes up, man, I have an opportunity to rescue one of these kids. Great. I'm all about it. Let's go do it. Well, the problem these organizations have is you're trying to rescue a bunch of kids that, depending on what level of indoctrination they're in, they don't want to be rescued. All right. They may have witnessed their parents be killed. The only allegiance they may have, the only emotional connection they may have, may be to the individuals that are trafficking them. And the individuals that are trafficking them are smart. You know, this isn't their first rodeo making child soldiers. So they've got this down to an art form. You know, they know just the amount of psychological pressure to apply. They know just the amount of needs to withhold and then provide, in essence, almost like a Stockholm syndrome, right? To be able to, if your situation is bad enough, I become your savior, right? If I come and bring you food when you're starving, you attach to me, especially if I show you some sort of kindness, some sort of caring, some sort of love, some sort of empathy, some sort of appreciation for you as a person. You want that so desperately because you're so deprived that now you connect to me for it. So, and then psychologically, right? I mean, we're talking about trauma-based disorders that are going to result not only from from the breaking down that occurs for them to start to connect to the individuals that are trafficking them, their captors, but also what they then will endure, what they'll have to do, who they'll have to kill, how they'll have to kill them as a result of this process, and what kind of just horrible things they'll see. Death of friends, death of individuals that they care about. And again, potentially they've already seen that. If they've been in an area that was taken over, then they've already seen that. ISIS was very good when they came in to Sinjar, which is the area where the Yazidis were held. This is where the Yazidis lived. When ISIS came in to Sinjar, they systematically separated out, just like a genocide, they systematically separated out the men from the women and the children. The men were taken to a place where they grew fish. It was a large, kind of like they were stock ponds, basically, which if you don't know what that is, they're a series of small ponds where they will grow fish in for a period of time. And they took the men, large numbers of them, in each of the surrounding villages that they had taken. They gathered them all in one place, and they summarily executed a large number of them. Most of the women and children didn't see this. They were separated out from the men, and they were taken to a centralized hub, and from there, it was decided what was going to happen with them. There was a specific city that they had conquered that they took everybody to, and then again, they divided them out from there. And again, the women and some of the girls, the majority of the girls, the young girls, were sold into sex slavery, and the boys were either recruited as child soldiers, or they were sold as labor, or also as sex slaves to individuals. So what we experienced when we went to Iraq was this example of what happens when you completely rip a culture apart, okay? And you completely divide it, and you completely separate it, and you're also talking about a culture that is heavily dominated by men, right? So there was a lot of connection for the women and the children to having a man for support and strength and structure. Women played in the Yazidi culture, they play a more limited role in the home. They have specific set tasks. So when you're talking about liberating them and rescuing them, you're talking about returning child soldiers to a culture where there are not men for them to attach to as strong role models, which means that at 14 or 15, if they're rescued at that age, or even 10, let's say, they may be the oldest male in their family. And if they're not the oldest male in their family, then the closest male they may have may be a grandparent, for example. So it is also difficult to get them to fit back into a structure or a hierarchy of where they are and what their appropriate place is in a family. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So again, when we talk about the psychological impact, trauma-based disorders, attachment issues, obviously the younger, the more likely they are to have attachment issues. Reduced ability to connect in a healthy way, in a positive way, and then struggles with affect regulation and impulse control. So if you take your teenager that lives at home, if you happen to have one, and then basically, I guess the best drug you could provide would be steroids. Like slip them some steroids that make them incredibly rageful and also incredibly angry and to act out. Then potentially you have an idea of what a 10, 11, or a 12-year-old focused child soldier might be like, right? Reduced pain tolerance, increased connection to physical ability, and then also just the anger and the rage and the focused destruction that they can apply without the ability to rein that in, almost as if they're going into an alternate state where they can just completely just function without any sort of moral code. And if done well, if broken down and rebuilt well by a trafficker, that's the kind of poignant weapon you have. And you also, in turn, have a human weapon that is not going to catch the attention sometimes of law enforcement, or is going to be able to walk into a mall and detonate a bomb or something like that, because they may not draw the kind of suspicion that is expected. Okay, so one of the other characteristics of these children is that you're going to have an identification with the trafficker's belief system. Their religious, their cultural, and their moral connection. Now, we've seen this in Iraq, both with the women and the children, right? Is that a lot of times the women, for example, will wear, will continue to wear even after the rescue, garments that fit the Muslim culture. Okay, they'll cover their faces. They'll do things that are not a requirement in the Yazidi culture, but they will do it in their culture, or they will do it even when rescued and in the IDP camps, which is the displaced person camps, just because it's a habit at this point, right? Like, this was a way to prevent from getting beaten. This was a way to prevent from getting abused. This was a way to prevent bad things from happening. So it's become second nature, muscle memory, if you will. I had to learn to think this way, because learning to think this way was about survival for me. And so again, when a trafficker is efficient at what they do, they'll try not to leave any remnant of the individual's psychological identity intact, that identity that they had before they were taken. They will try and strip them of that, and then basically condition them and build them up with what ideology they want them to follow. So, and on a little sidebar here, so this is an interesting experience, because I'm used to getting feedback from the audience. Obviously, I can read the faces of everyone in the room, and I can't do that here. So I've got to look at this camera over here. I find myself looking at myself. It's not because I think I'm great. It's weird. So anyways, just kind of bear with me if I'm not staring directly at the camera. I'm trying to get used to looking at this little bright light right in front of me. So anyways, continuing on. So some of the other characteristics is exposure to situations beyond their development and intellectual maturity level. So one of the things that we experienced when we were there was this little guy that was able to drive a car. And he was 10 years old, and he had been rescued. He had been recovered. Basically, what ISIS did is they actually had released him. And they had released him in exchange for, I don't remember, something that they needed. And so they had released this child back to his family. I think his family had ransomed him back or something. So anyways, so they had released him, and so he had come back, and he was living with his aunt. And so when he got frustrated and had too much, he would leave their house and he would go and sit in the car. And we sat there and watched him as he's inside this car, and he's fumbling, he's looking for the keys, and he's trying to turn the ignition, and he's trying to start this car up, and he knows exactly how to do it, and he's 10 years old. So this is the kind of experience that, again, I mean, these children are made to be highly functional, to be able to carry out tasks that are way above their developmental level, which, again, as you can imagine, if I'm going to rescue a child, I'm not used to thinking about having to make sure 8-year-olds can't drive away from wherever I rescue them and take them to. But this is a real risk, right? Like, this is a real threat. It's a real threat that they're going to be able to know how to cut through a chain link fence. It's a real threat that they're going to know how to tunnel out of somewhere. It's a real threat that they're going to be able to know how to fashion weapons out of pieces of metal or wood or sticks. It's a real possibility that if they get their hands on a knife, that they're going to know how to absolutely carve somebody up. And so again, it's a matter when treating this population, it's a matter of keeping a level of vigilance with them to watch out for the security of yourself and everyone else, but then also try to turn them back into children. So imagine the conflict of this, right? That the individuals and the mental health care providers that are working in these programs, what they face, because if I turn a child back into a child, then I want to trust that child is a child. If I turn a child back into a child and I still treat them like they're a focused killer, then does that child trust me? Does that child believe? Do I show them the appropriate amount of empathy to help them with their growth? So in essence, I've got to show some vulnerability, maybe physical vulnerability or emotional vulnerability as part of this process. I can't keep my guard up all the time as a facilitator, but yet I have to keep it up enough to make sure that everyone is protected. It's a crazy dynamic. And I give the individuals who work with this population such credit. And a lot of times we don't even think about this in our American criminal justice system, but when we talk about reform schools or institutions that care for children that are in for violent crimes, I mean, this is the same sort of situation that they have to go through. And it is an incredibly taxing and incredibly difficult experience, especially when, again, as you would expect, as we do with all our clients, at some point you've got to put trust in that child. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about the treatment challenges. How do you know, right? How do you know that child has changed? How do you know that they've moved from what they were? Because what they are is something new, but with a very deadly skill set. And they still have it. They still possess it. Can't erase the memories. So at any moment, they can become a focused killer. Very difficult dynamic to deal with. Okay, so to finish up that point about exposure to situations, one of the things this does is we're talking about resulting deficits in impulse control. Okay, but then also, what we see with children all the time, if any of us have kids, right, is the lack of long-term decision making. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because, again, I mean, this is just sort of a given with anyone who has kids or works around kids. The majority of us have had training. If we're mental health professionals or we work in social services in any way, to know that this is an issue. But it does present a very complex element, again, when you're talking about a soldier that is used to running autonomously. Okay, so again, when you have a highly focused individual, you give them a set of directions, you set them out, and you want them to think on their own. I mean, this is one of the most important things of training someone into a military environment is when things go bad, what do you do, right? How do you handle that? And so these children are given the ability to operate way above their age level, right? And so as a result, they become good at it. And so now we're going to come into an environment where we're going to say, fit back into your normal life. Be a kid again, right? Listen to your parents. Take direction from somebody else who's older than you. Value their opinions. Very, very difficult situation. So how do you get submission, right? How do you take a child that has had all this responsibility heaped on them and put it back in a situation where they're going to submit to some degree of authority when they potentially have had none? Okay, if their abduction was part of a genocide, then the children may struggle to develop a sense of bonding. And this is true, right? So immediately what we're talking about is some of these children know that their parents are dead. Some of them have been told that their parents are dead. Some of them watched their parents be killed. So the strongest connections that they may have, along with immediate members of their family. So the strongest connections they have are gone. So when they're rescued, when we try and reintegrate them into a community, when we try and restore their sense of mental health, we're asking them to connect to something, to connect to someone, to rebuild the connection. And again, given what age they were taken at, there are some questions as to whether or not that's even going to be possible. When we talk about the recipe for how do personality disorders begin, right? What we know is severe abuse in childhood can create the foundation for a personality disorder. These children are being exposed to that, not to mention trauma-based disorders. So can they connect? Can they lower their guard down well enough to connect? Does the idea of vulnerability scare them so bad it makes them violent? Child soldiers may not know the religious and social norms of the culture that they are returning to. I feel like we went too far, did we? No, I guess we moved into treatment challenges. Okay, sorry. Again, I apologize. This from my screen, the PowerPoint's very small. So we're in treatment challenges. So child soldiers may not know the religious and social norms they're returning to. So imagine they've been indoctrinated to become, for example, to identify with Islam, okay, or another belief system. Again, one of the things a lot of people don't know about Boko Haram, which is the large terrorist group that exists in Nigeria, is that there are some elements of Boko Haram that are very much embedded in radical Islam, but there are other factions, breakoffs. There's actually 3 separate networks of Boko Haram, 3 different, literally almost independent organizations operating underneath the same title as Boko Haram. And one of those is actually very tribal in nature. So they have a pagan belief system that they are attached to. And so they are not radical Islam, but they are indeed, again, this pagan system. So again, depending on how the child has been indoctrinated, they may end up going back into a culture like the Yazidi culture, for example, and they don't remember, if they were taken at a young enough age, they don't remember the religion that they were a part of. But the Yazidi culture is predicated on the idea of their religion being the centerpiece, okay, the Yazidi faith. So there's that. Then also there is the issue of they don't know the culture itself. So they may not know the social norms, right? They don't know how to actually function effectively or efficiently within the culture. Let me give you an example. So if, let's say they've been liberated for a couple of years but haven't had any sort of counseling, if they want to approach a girl in the culture, a young lady, they're interested in her, how do they do that, right? Do they know how, right? Are they comfortable enough, or do they have a social support system that they've built to ask other peers? And now we get into something that Stephen Porges talks a lot about, which, again, if y'all aren't familiar with him, he's a fantastic resource to understand the nervous system and the way that the nervous system impacts how we interact just in general, but also how trauma changes us and how it affects our overall ability to connect with other individuals. And so obviously one of the things that we know happens with trauma is this sense of isolation. If you're a child soldier and I remove you and I put you into a culture and I ask you to interact with children that have not been soldiers, are you going to be able to connect to any of them? Are you going to feel like that you can bond with them, that they have any sense of who you are? Or are you going to feel like you've got so many unique experiences that this other individual can't compete? You know, not now. Add on top of that, do you have a level of sophistication and a level of maturity? Have you been exposed to enough things that you know how to be a leader when these other children don't? One of the things that we found fascinating when we went to Iraq is that we had this opportunity, again, I think to sit with this one child soldier. And he was fascinating. We gathered a lot of information from him in general because we got to see him in a different setting. And so he sits down, and it was mealtime in the house. So there weren't any men in the household. It was all women. And so his aunt and a few of the other women, they absolutely fawned over this male child. And again, males have a very strong place in the culture. Plus, when we were there, he had been back with them for 2 weeks, which is one of the reasons, again, why I highlight him a couple times, because we were able to see him at a point where he hadn't truly transitioned back yet. I mean, he was very fresh to being back. And so they take him, and so he's sitting on the floor, and they hand him what looked like, the best way I know how to describe it, looked like a can of Spam, right? I think it was something that they had gotten from probably that had been donated, or some food that they were utilizing that probably came from UNICEF, because that's who ran the IDP camp where we were at. And so he's got this thing of Spam, and they hand him a knife. All right, now remind you, this is a child that's been liberated for 2 weeks. And he uses that knife, and the way he handles that at 10 years old, the way he cuts that food into segments and how quick and efficient he was with it, I mean, it was absolutely amazing to watch. I mean, just his level of proficiency. So, and so they're all fawning over him, and he's having next to no contact with them. I mean, he literally is, they hand him something, he's ignoring them. And if he wants something, he's ordering them what to do. So if he's like, very, 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 very deliberate. Just, go get this, go do that. Bring me this. Come here. as if he is the man in the house. So then he leaves. So then that he eats, and it becomes very obvious that the attention that he's getting is overwhelming him. And so he leaves out of the house, and there are a ton of children that are outside. They've all pretty much gathered. We were in a little town there in Kurdistan, which is the northern part of Iraq, which is where the majority of the IDP camps are. And we were there. And so when Americans roll in, obviously everybody knows it within a few minutes. And so a lot of children have gathered. So he takes his food, and he ate about half of it. And he walks out with a can into this huge group of children, and they all encircle around him because they know him and they know what he is and they know that he's back, and they're not afraid of him either. And in fact, it's almost to watch them interact with him, it's almost as if they're enamored with him. Like he has respect, especially amongst the boys. So some of the girls are more standing back, the young girls are standing back, but the boys are clamoring to this kiddo. And so he starts handing out his food that he had left over to the other boys that are there. And you could almost see the inner workings of how he is grooming the crowd of boys, right? To be able to value him and to be able to setting up a leadership structure with him at the top. So he has something to give, and he gives it to the underlings. So he's starting to use and demonstrate some of the same techniques that were used on him. So in other words, he's been programmed, right? He's been conditioned, if you will, to know how to implement. So we talk about the term deprogramming not being a reputable term to utilize, but we can say when we talk about what's been done that they've been conditioned, they've been programmed to operate in a particular way, and that's fine to use that languaging. So one of the biggest issues that affects the successful implementation of any program is, and this is across the board, what you hear from folks that are doing this work, is whether or not child soldiers are accepted back into the community. The reality is they are oftentimes stigmatized, they are rejected, they potentially are persecuted. You've got to remember they represent now, especially if there's been a genocide, they represent the enemy. And so you have got a lot of strong passions in and amongst members, family members of the culture who has lost valued loved ones to ISIS, for example. And now here comes this child that represents ISIS. And so they've fled ISIS. They fled. They maybe have had, if they didn't decide to take up arms and fight ISIS, for example, or fight an occupying group in a particular area, then this child may be the only exposure that a family member has to take their anger and rage out. And so if they aren't directly hateful or cause physical harm to this child, then maybe they snub them, right? Or they make them feel different. Or they use racial slurs or who knows what, right? Or religious slurs or, things to kind of keep them separated. So one of the things that's crucial is to reintegrate these children back into the community. It's not necessarily what we've experienced so difficult to get them reintegrated with their family, but it's more, will they be accepted into the culture as a whole? Or will the whole family be stigmatized as a result, which is also very, very difficult. So one of the things that Porges says, which again is incredibly valuable, is that you've got to be able to connect to other human beings to truly heal from trauma. So what these children have been through, the amount of shame and guilt that they may be carrying, to be able to release that, they've got to have the ability to reconnect with their culture. And if they can't do that, if they're isolated or kept outside, then it's going to be very difficult for them to form any sort of attachments or bonds that are going to steer them in the direction of health and happiness. It's also very likely that they may go in a different direction. And again, now they'll be potential prey to groups or organizations that are looking to capitalize on their skill set that will utilize the exact same techniques, maybe not on such a aggressive level as their traffickers, but maybe like a gang, for example, or a criminal organization. They may be very attractive to a criminal organization or a radical group that opposes, this or that or some sort of political, moral, or religious agenda. Okay. All right. So we mentioned this a little bit previously. Just this idea that they're going to struggle with submission when they were previously more autonomous or entrusted with even leadership roles. So again, you're asking a child to come back and be a kid, right? Be a kid and submit, and basically let somebody run their life for them, which, depending on how old they are, may be very, very difficult. If you can create the right dynamic, then it's a welcome change for them. It's freedom, right? It's freedom than the oppression. If they can connect to the fact that they were oppressed, if they can connect to the fact that they were, in essence, ostracized, if they were abused, if you can get them to see themselves as victims of abuse, then they can connect to being a survivor, and survivor has freedom, and they can be kids again. But also, a lot of this depends on whether you can create the right social dynamic for them. They'll be free to run around and play soccer with their peers if they have peers to run around and play soccer with. So being able to create that sense of connection is really, really important. This is why I think one of the probably the best ways, and again, I don't have anything to base this on, but one of the things that from what I've seen with this population, is that they seem to truly benefit from the opportunity to be rescued together in groups, because they're already connected to those individuals. They initially need to be separated so that their own issues can be addressed, but then to reconnect them and have them use the same network that they had connections with before to grow them into a positive, helpful way seems to be incredibly, incredibly beneficial. So, okay, so let's talk about the general desensitization that goes on to using violence as an option to gain power or control. So there's a general lack of emotional connection to consequences that happens just at this age in general. But then obviously when you add the level of naturally what occurs in traumatization, which is the dissociation, that dissociation makes it incredibly difficult for them to be able to connect and keep connected in the present moment and to access potentially the proper emotions to be able to handle any given situation. So, so you've got this potentially violent individual that's capable of violence, is what I should say, capable of violence. And then you have them disconnected from the emotions that provide them a context of regulation. So if I'm not connected to my physiology, so in other words, if I've got this disconnect between brain and body, then I'm not hearing messages that are coming from my physiology. So like that feeling I get when I'm about to do something, like me personally, like that feeling I get when I'm about to do something that goes against my moral code or my ethics, they won't feel that, right? So in essence, there becomes no governor on their behavior. They have the ability to go to extremes of behavior and feel no regret or no remorse for those actions. And obviously, this is one of the things that becomes a recipe, or becomes an element, if you will, part of the recipe, I should say, for psychopathy, which, given the amount of abuse that they experience, they're in essence hardwired for it. So, so then when you have the brain-body disconnect, then you also have, they've been built potentially or conditioned to have cognitive thinking patterns that will support the expression of that unregulated anger. Okay, so, again, so this 10-year-old that we were talking about, or I was mentioning, this 10-year-old was taken, he'd been in ISIS captivity for 4 years. So he was taken when he was 6. And many of us can't even remember but a couple memories or a few from when we were that age, and very little before that. So his entire context for how he processes situations on a cognitive level, how he handles this, how he handles that, his decision making, is going to likely be predicated on what he was conditioned with. And so that's going to be the thought pattern that dominates his emotional regulation. So it's almost like two parts of a storm. You have this disconnect from physiology, and then you have this mind that isn't properly telling you right from wrong, good from bad, and is actually sanctioning uses of violence as a way to get needs met. So if I need power and control, violence becomes a way I can accomplish that. And it doesn't take but a few expressions of that, especially in and amongst an IDP population or a rescued population, to see the benefits of that. For example, like when we talk about the formation of criminal thinking in America, if I utilize my power and the use of that power brings about the result that I want, then I'm basically becoming conditioned to a belief system that says, if I need this, I do this, I get that. I choose the person wisely. I choose someone who looks like they'll be a victim. Then I use my power to bring about what I want. So again, which hits our last point, right? Over-identification with violence as a symbol of strength and status. All right, so knowledge and skills that are a threat to treatment providers and clients. In other words, they possess this knowledge. They can harm us very easily. So if you're ever working with anyone, the fact that that exists for them is a real risk to providers. They can have suicidal or homicidal tendencies. Again, that lack of long-term thinking, the lack of development around mature long-term thinking makes them very prone to impulses with whatever's going on in that moment. Their elevated internal threat response system. So in other words, when we talk about what is happening on a physiological level, their nervous system is wired to a higher level of operation. So in other words, they're more likely to snap, right? They're closer to the snap point. As with sometimes what you find with a victim of trauma, right? They're quick to jump into what would be considered an elevated response or a hyperstate response to overcome whatever they perceive as the threat, but to someone else who hasn't had their trauma, that threat may look like their threat response, the way their body responds, may look like it's over the top, may look like maybe more than what a higher level of elevation or activation that was necessary to deal with that. There is also in the cultures that we're talking about rescuing these soldiers from, one of the treatment challenges of poor knowledge around mental health. This was demonstrated frequently when we worked in Iraq. Every time we would go and try and sit with an individual, they always thought we were doctors, right? And they were always trying to tell us what their physical medical history was because they thought we were there to provide medications to help them. So there's just a general lack of knowledge, which obviously makes the buy-in harder and more important all at the same time. If they buy in and they can connect to the results, they feel some relief, then things will be different for them, right? And then, of course, a lot of times, even in the IDP camps in Kurdistan, for example, up until about 6 months ago, there was always just a real and ever-present fear that ISIS may have a resurgence. Okay, so there's always a lot of times when these displaced persons are being relocated, they're never relocated all that far from the front lines, right? Within 60, 70, 80, maybe 100 miles. So you've also got, the challenge of trying to tell an individual or help an individual see that the hyper elevated state of their nervous system is not helping them, but it is actually a very practical, understandable, and appropriate response to the level of danger that they're experiencing and how close they are to that danger, right? It's not unheard of for someone to walk in, especially if we're talking about suicide bombers or some sort of zealotry, religious or ethnic, for somebody to walk into an IDP camp and detonate a bomb, So there is this ever-present fear. One of the traumas that we've seen repeatedly that we've had to work with the women in Iraq is even the sound of a jet flying overhead or a plane flying overhead automatically brings up that physiological reactivity. So, and these guys have been on the front line, these young men. So they're highly sensitive to what's going on in the environment and any signs of danger. So helping them see again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to tell them and help them feel, because they need to feel that they can be a kid again. But imagine trying to be a kid again 100 miles from a war zone when maybe 6 months ago or 4 months ago or 2 months ago or 2 weeks ago, you had a weapon in your hand and you were killing the enemy. Hard transition to make for them. Okay. So there are so let's jump to treatment models now. There are three primary types of treatment models that are utilized that currently exist to treat child soldiers. And again, so this first one that we're going to talk about is less used with child soldiers and more frequently is utilized with cult members. But it's worth mentioning just so you have a context and a framework for what it looks like in case you see it or have any run-ins with it and you're trying to identify if it's a valid program or the validity of it. So the first one is a deprogramming model, and that's pretty much what it's called. It can also be referred to as exit counseling, and this type of model involves hold on involves changing one's controversial or subversive beliefs and allegiances to religious, political, economic, or social groups. It often involves kidnapping. So, in other words, these instead of a rescue, right? Although a rescue really is in most times a kidnapping for a child soldier because they're leaving what they're comfortable with, but it involves kidnapping, and then it can involve violence or deception and manipulation to try and, in essence, do what we said is not appropriate, which is deprogram them. All right, hence the name of the type of program, right? So when you talk about deprogramming, this is what a lot of times anybody who's familiar with in the mental health field, this is what they're going to think of. They're going to think of this type of programming, which again may very well not be what you're discussing. But so that's what this kind of program is. And again, it's like shock and awe, pretty much, of trying to get them out of it. It's basically using forced coercion to undo the effects of coercion. And so, as you can imagine, there are some. It's hard to replicate. It is hard to validate the results of this type of program. It is often denounced as a treatment option, given the propensity for inflicting harm. So there's some very negative views towards it. And again, there's no standardized format for doing this. It's more of an idea or a form of treatment than it is actually anything that relies on any sort of set protocol. Well, as a result of that, there is no research validity to it because it's nearly impossible without a protocol to replicate any sort of results. I don't often like to say impossible, but the reality is it's impossible. So to replicate results when you have no protocol for treatment and or implementation. So the next type of treatment model is what's called the DDR model. Okay, and the DDR stands for there's three different phases. There's disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Those are the three phases. Okay, these programs are primarily being utilized in Africa, South America, Asia, the Middle East. There are versions and pockets of this program being utilized in different areas. The goal is to disarm and disband warring groups, utilizing this model, and then formulate a reintegration. So this is basically the systematic. When I'm disarming a group, or a group is willfully surrendering, so they're turning themselves in willingly. This is the three-stage model to take them from that moment of surrender all the way through reintegration. And so the disarmament phase is where they turn in their weapons and they basically submit themselves to whatever authority is going to help them through the process of reintegration. Now, the next phase is the demobilization, and that is where individuals are divided up into groups, sizable, manageable groups, and they're taken to some sort of central facility, some holding area or something where their basic needs are met and taken care of. Okay? And this is where they start and where they're going to receive counseling and where they're basically going to start down the program that is going to lead to the final stage of reintegration. So this is both a financial assistance, economic. They're going to get some goods and services, and then they're also going to have counseling and potentially vocational training since they may have lost their vocation. And then the reintegration phase is the most important factor is success. And success of the program is that the child is accepted by one's family or culture, like we mentioned. So basically that they are able to be reintegrated into a body or a social group, okay? So commonly identified desires of children soldier, that's where we're getting some research on what they really want and what is most helpful for them. So they want to return to family. They want to return to schools. They want to return to a state of normalcy, which obviously is a great foundation for being able to help them with healing. They want the absence of fear and violence, and they want acceptance back into their community after the heinous acts that they've done, right? So, and a lot of them, again, once that psychologically starts to turn for them, and they continue to move into healing, and the nervous system starts to readjust to a healthy level of functioning. Once they start to stop dissociating and stop compartmentalizing their feelings and emotions, part of the recovery process and the reintegration process and the restoration process for them is going to be coming to terms with the things that they've done, facing what in essence oftentimes is a flood of emotions around guilt, shame, and so on. So crucial aspects to be able to bring about a successful reintegration program is safety. It's going to be skills training, education, meeting their basic needs, having they're going to need an emotional outlet in a place to be able to reprocess their experiences. They're going to need economic development, and again, acceptance back into the culture. The third form of treatment, the third type of model, is called a reflection period. Okay, what this model is basically almost kind of like we would conceptualize an inpatient program, a 30 to 90 day place where they are put into, that they go in, they receive services, they get medical aid, they get counseling, they go through a process, and then they're returned to the community afterwards. The problem with this type of program is that oftentimes that 30 days is the end. It's the end of it. Okay, once that happens, once they get to that place, they're done. There's nothing else that occurs after that. There is no follow-up. So if they have issues with the community, if they have issues with reintegration, there's nobody there to address them. And there oftentimes is no support other than indigenous support for them. So not the best alternative, not the best choice, but it is being utilized in certain areas. And again, so there's access to psychological and medical help. So there are some good parts to it, but the reality is it's not the best of the three choices for how to bring somebody to a period of restoration. So, all right. So one of the things that I've realized, we're at the end. And one of the things I have realized is, I don't know if you have the ability to scroll through the slides or not, but it would appear that I have an updated version of this PowerPoint that this is not it. This is actually an older version. So if you have some additional slides at the end of this, I'm fixing to delete this off of here and put the new one on. And that one also has a picture of this 10-year-old boy that I was talking about. And so I'm going to put that on here, and you'll have that to look at and peruse through. Also, if you're fixing to exit off of this because you're done at the Lunch and Learn and you're tired of listening to me, then you can also just reach out to me on that email I provided. I'll email a copy of it to you directly if you'd like your own personal copy. But anyways, I just want to say that I very much appreciate the time today. Thank you very much for tuning in. And I hope you found this informative and educational, and that it's been a benefit to you. I am gonna be here for about another 50 minutes or so for questions. So if any of you would like to throw any questions up on that chat screen, I'm happy to answer them for you. I'll get to as many as I can. But also, again, please don't hesitate to email me to get more of those questions answered as we go forward. So once again, thank you very much, everyone. And this is a great opportunity. And thank you to the Arizona Trauma Institute for putting it on for us. So thank you. All right, so let me go to the chat screen here and see if there's any questions on here to look at. Okay, so Valerie had put up a question real quick regarding the email, so I'm just going to give that out verbally again. It is N as in Nora, S as in Sam, C as in Charles. So NSC, my name, Brian, BRIAN, last name Simmons, SIMMONS, at gmail.com. And if you scroll through the chat screen, I think you got the ability to go up and down. I'm not sure. It's also listed in there if you have any questions. And so, again, please, there isn't a way for me to track who wants the slides on here. But if you email me directly, I will send them to you. I'm happy to do so. Okay, any questions at all? Wrap this up. Zach, thank you very much for the tech support, by the way, buddy. You did a great job. So far I'm not seeing any questions. I'm going to give it a minute or two more to see if any pop up. Oh, okay, here we go. Um, so Kristen put up a statement that said it seems like a hard feat to get a child soldier to be a child again when their innocence was taken. Such horrible things to see. Yeah, I would agree 100%. I got to be honest with you, though. One of the things we found to be really interesting is you cannot underestimate the power of the indigenous culture when they're accepted to be able to help them recover. We got a couple updates on that child that I had referenced earlier from the individuals that are there because we obviously have a continuous connection there. And that child is actually doing pretty well. He's been able to integrate pretty good. Now, so we haven't heard any acts of violence or anything like that. Now, we haven't seen for ourselves what that looks like, but I can tell you that the women that we're in contact with there who know his family have reported that he's making the transition. I mean, it's taken time, obviously, but he seems like he's kind of returning to that. So the fall of ISIS obviously has created a sense of safety for everybody there, and I think that's been a really instrumental part of him being able to develop. All right, so let's see what else we've got. So Jamie asked a question, would you say that there is an overlap with victims of domestic violence? That is an incredibly good question, Jamie. You know, the interesting thing that we found, so the way this all developed for us with Iraq is that we were recruited by an organization because they knew of our interest in trauma. And I had been working domestically with this organization, working with sex trafficking victims. And so obviously you have all the complex elements of sex trafficking and the industry and the sex industry on mental health and all these different aspects, domestic violence being one of them. So I was recruited by this organization because they wanted to get into the international realm and do work internationally. So they wanted to see if this population was a population that we could work with. So that's what got us going over there. And so I was like, you know what, I want to see, you know, I'm ex-police. I like the adrenaline. I'll go, right? So I went over there and so the first trip that we sat with them in the tents and we met with women and children to just basically do assessments and figure out where are they at. You know, can we communicate? Can we work through the language barriers? Can we deliver any sort of services over here with the impediments that are there? And I got to be honest with you, I was incredibly impressed with the ability of them to, number one, talk about what had gone on with them. They were very humble and accommodating people, so they shared a great deal. But one of the things that was really interesting that really solidified for me the work that I do is that trauma manifests the same everywhere. It does not matter what you've been through. It doesn't matter what it is. There is a general conceptualized understanding of it that when you get it, when you understand it, when you see it, you can apply it to different contexts in different areas. And yes, the particular challenges are different and the circumstances are different, but the way it manifests for the individual are very much the same. So yes, the level of indoctrination in domestic violence, the passivity that occurs, the way emotional abuse, especially for women, basically gives them limited options. And so they basically choose the best route for survival and you end up in a long-term survival mindset. It's very similar. So a lot of the same principles that we talk about utilizing to treat child soldiers are the same way you would utilize to treat a woman who's coming out of domestic violence, right? And it's similar also in the sense that when you take somebody out of a relationship, especially if they've never had any healthy relationships, so which is similar to a child that's never seen any help, that maybe was abducted at a very young age before they had a real strong formulation of how to actually have relationships, you basically have to reteach them how to be healthy. You have to teach them how to handle it, and they're going to make mistakes along the way, just like a woman coming out of domestic violence as she tries to formulate new love relationships. So really fascinating stuff with that. So great question. So another question from Wen Chen Lin. I wonder if you know these families' children would give a chance to resettle to the U.S. or refugees, or they're no longer eligible for resettlement. Well, to be honest with you, they are actually being resettled. Resettlement is still occurring. There is an active community in Canada right now, as a matter of fact, that is still taking in refugees from overseas. Now, there are a large number of them that still need relocation. The homeland for the Yazidis, Sinjar, which is where the majority of them are located, is absolutely in rubble. There is a goal eventually to rebuild that area, but there is no one has come forward. No nation has come forward yet with enough financial resources for them to rebuild a full community. In essence, imagine you lived in a city and you have this culture and community in a city, and the entire city's laid to waste, right? So you can't just put people back there. You have to build services. You have to build businesses and industry to be able to support. You have to have food to be, grocery stores and, repair folks that are in industries that can repair and fix and do all this. So they have to rebuild the entire culture, and they haven't. So yes, they're still being relocated. And there's still organizations that are taking folks. There's a huge area of resettlement in Germany, another one in the Netherlands. So again, some of these countries have stepped up. Unfortunately, more haven't. I wish they had, but more haven't. So it would be nice to see that continue, but it is still continuing. So Whitney asked a question for you about the use of the term trafficker. Are these the same people as their ISIS captors? Traffickers are ISIS. So traffickers are any individual anywhere from the acquisition to the actual delivery of an individual for a service, everybody in between. So a merchant potentially who runs a ship that the individual will be transported on, but isn't actually the one who abducted, or the criminal organization that's running it, they're considered a trafficker as well. So a trafficker is anyone from point A, from the point of acquisition to the destination. So these individual members of ISIS, we're talking about those that are basically trainers, right? These are the ones that are kind of like drill sergeants in our military, right? They're the ones that are getting these kiddos and indoctrinating them. But ISIS, because as an organization, as a group, I should say, because they're not technically an organization, but as a group, as a terrorist group, all of them are traffickers because they all support the activity. So great question, Whitney. I may mispronounce this, but the name is Elke, I believe. So a question was, which organization was I asked to work with? So Valiant Hearts was the organization. They're local here to Texas, and they're an organization that is the one that I worked with. So Jamie asked another question. Can you recommend any resources that we can refer to for more information? I'll tell you what, Jamie, that's actually a great email question. My wife and I have a list of organizations that are active both locally and internationally, and we can plug you into some of those depending on what information you're looking for. So again, if it's local resources in your area, we may have some for you there. If it's international, we've got some for you there as well. So, all right. Well, I think I've answered everybody's questions. So again, thank you very much for your time. It's a great opportunity, and I appreciate having the time to chat with you all, and hopefully I'll be hearing from you soon. So have a great day, y'all.